Hi, welcome back to the podcast of sorts, and I am your host of sorts, Lucas. Although I don't see myself as a host, I see myself as just another person talking into a microphone, and people listen. So, I don't know what that makes me. Maybe a commentator. But that's not the point. The point is, we're back with an episode 2, and it's been interesting trying to release an episode 2. Yesterday, not the day the first podcast released, but the day after. This is my second day working on episode 2 in short. And that's been interesting. This is the first project that I've ever dedicated my time to where structure and flow do not matter. And I mean that genuinely. Like, yesterday I was like, okay, what do I want to talk about? What is it going to be? How am I going to approach it? And I started off every episode I tried to work on, all rough drafts of the one we're listening to now. I started off with a structure of sorts, a very flimsy structure, nothing too life changing. Essentially, I didn't go about messing with what I planned to do with this. I just wanted to one mention some corrections I added to the first episode, and two talk about an emotional reaction to the first episode. But as I was speaking and as I was listening back to myself, I finished only one episode, one potential episode that I could have released. But allow me to explain why I deleted it. I deleted it not because it was bad, but because it felt forced. There was something in my brain that was telling me this doesn't seem free flowing. It doesn't seem like the structure you set up. And I couldn't understand how that could happen, how I'd be so vehemently opposed to structure. I've never been opposed to structure before. My writing follows a pretty simple basis. I like brainstorming, I like plotting things out, I like having reference points for my characters and my stories and my metaphors so that they know where they're going to go. But with this podcast, I wrote down like maybe 2 bullet points. One, the title, and two, some quick things I wanted to mention, and that was it. Like I wrote down some artist names because I was going to talk about artists and criticism and exploring art, which I still want to do, but every time I tried to do it the way I was starting yesterday, it wasn't working. And so we're here today, being day 2 of writing or of recording these podcasts, and I'm just throwing structure to the wind. I'm I have no notes to go from. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. I have no references, no bullet points, nothing. I have just the bullet points from yesterday, and that's it. And I'm probably not going to even use them. Like, I only want to use them just so you know what I was going to say yesterday, which was that I wanted to talk about criticism, how to handle criticism, and then I also wanted to kind of delve into exploring art from outside your comfort zone. So that would be um, artists that you don't know of, or art forms you've never watched or experienced, I guess, because art is such a weird thing. You can't really give one verb to it, and just you can't hear all art. You can experience it though. You get what I mean. So I wanted to talk about that, but it just wasn't working. I was like, okay, so that's not working, and so I am just trying my best to produce something that is not going to be thrown away, is not going to be disposed of, because I really want this to work. I have no intentions of not giving in. I mean, of not giving up. That's a double negative. I'm trying to say that I have no intention of giving up. That's what I mean. And when I was presented with that challenge, it became easy to wonder why I'm doing it. Because I guess it may not be for everyone, but that's for me. That's my response. Is why am I doing this if there's so much adversity? Like, you'd think that there's some obstacles that you can't break. But that's not how it works. It's an obstacle and it's in your way because you're supposed to break it. It's like hurdle jumping in track and field, which seems like such a strenuous sport. But the purpose of hurdle jumping is you sprint for a certain distance, and then you leap over increasing increments of hurdles. So let's say there's a 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. That's a bad example because they won't be that small, but it goes in those increments where it increases. And so the hurdler has to jump over increasing hurdles until they reach the finish line. And that's, in essence, what a lot of work is obstacles. You come across a challenge and you accomplish the challenge, and then you've already surpassed that hurdle, so that hurdle is going to be easy. Trivial stuff, like, really, 3 feet, I can jump that. And, you prepared for this, so you know how to jump 3 feet. And then the 4 foot hurdle comes up, and you're like, okay, that's a little more challenging, and 5 feet, and then 6 feet. That's kind of where I was at yesterday, was a 6 foot hurdle, because I was prepared for negative criticism. I was prepared for not liking the podcast's first episode. I was prepared for adversity in recording, like just having mental blocks or not having the right atmosphere. Like yesterday, I made the mistake of purchasing a milkshake, and it made me very burpy, and the audio just came out really poorly, and I was really upset about that. Like, I just couldn't stop burping, and so no matter how intellectual the podcast was, it was just interrupted by human bodily functions, and I was really upset by that. But they were like only thinly visible. Like, you could only barely hear them if you knew what you were looking for. But I scrapped it because I didn't want that. So I was prepared for all those adversities. But then when it just felt like yesterday trying to release the second episode was the 6 foot. And I don't know why I jumped to that conclusion. No pun intended. But for some reason, not being able to release an episode when I wanted to felt like the end of the world. Well, not the end of the world. It wasn't tragic. It just felt like the end of an era for this idea, where it had its reign and now it's time to put it in the books. I felt very one and done, essentially. And that's not a mentality I should have regardless, even if it is one and done. Like, you don't know it's one and done. I mean, let's go back so very far back, about 3 years ago. I know I talk about my first book often, but that's because there's so much that I went through as an artist that is now in my workman's tools, So when I first wrote the book and I finished it, or I was writing it, it just felt like very in the moment, like it was so surreal to be doing this, and it was great, it was fun, and I loved it a lot. But when you finish it, you're like, is this one and done? Am I never gonna write a book again? And that not even tied to the criticism I received, although it was constructive criticism. The idea that it was one and done was connected only to my self-esteem. The idea that, like, well, maybe I'm out of good ideas now. Maybe this was the only good idea I'll ever have in years. I was wrong. I've written, several really good short stories that I'm proud of, and they've only shown growth. But that's not the point. The point is, I jumped to the conclusion of one and done because I couldn't imagine anything else. I couldn't. I don't think I have that good foresight to see into where things are going to take me and where ideas are going to go. Probably because I don't have good predictive nature, but it might not be that. It might be neither here nor there. It just might be that I don't have good foresight, and that's just how it goes. And I'm okay with that. Like, I don't have a problem with that. It's just that lack of foresight leads me to jumping to conclusions of, oh, am I a one and done, So that was my problem, was I was really worried that nothing good was going to come out of this podcast again. Or, I was going to release the second episode and people are going to be like, wow, the first one was really good because you just talked about podcasts and you had no structure and blah, blah, blah. Whereas with this one, it's like, okay, now I have to be interesting, or I have to have some sort of launch pad, and even thinking about it now, my brain's like, what are you going to do for episode 3? Like, how are you going to possibly come up with a topic to talk about that people are going to find interesting, because I don't have good enough foresight to trust where this is going. And I'm processing this right now. Like, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I have no idea this is what I was going to talk about, and I've never thought about this before. Which is going to be the case for a lot of things I say on this podcast, is I've never thought of this before. Not consciously, at least. I know subconsciously I probably thought about it, but it never came to the forefront because my internal mind, the thoughts inside of your head, is far more chaotic than when I speak. And so when I speak, I can let things launch out and I can process them. My brain can process them. So it's two processings going on at once, which is why I think this is really therapeutic. Is, no one else will listen to it. I will, at least. Not because I find my voice soothing or interesting or anything like that, but because these are thoughts I've never had before. These are things I'm working through that I didn't know I was working through. It's kind of like you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm a blacksmith. And I've been working on the sword for a long time, but I didn't know I was working on the sword for a long time. That's really weird. And then someone's like, I want to buy your sword. Your blacksmith. I don't know why you would buy a blacksmith. But they come in and they want to buy the sword, and it's like, oh, people want to buy my swords. Like, I didn't know I was making swords for sale. Like, this is really interesting. All that extensive analogy to say that it's just processing for the sake of processing. I don't know what I'll do with this information. It's just information that's being said. And we just go with it, pretty much. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with a lot of things I'll say on this podcast. But some things may give me shock or disturb the peace, I suppose. And that's the trajectory I think I would want, is disturbed peace. Not bad disturbing peace, but like one where you're like, oh, I've been doing this wrong, or this is where I really want to go. Like this podcast is disturbing the peace, pretty much, because it's a Sunday morning, and I could very much be just back playing Skyrim, but here I am, sitting in my room, talking to myself, disturbing the peace. Changing the trajectory for my own sake, if not for someone else's. And it's going well so far, apparently. I don't know how else to describe it. I know it seems chaotic, or I'm describing it as chaotic, but it's disturbing the peace in a good way, Not releasing a podcast yesterday turned out to be a really good decision. Because they just weren't up to par. They weren't up to what I wanted it to be. And I learned that, hey, this shouldn't have structure. If it's not going to have structure, don't sacrifice. Don't give up on your original idea for the sake of appeasing people, And there's no one to appease. Like, no one's like, oh, I really wish there was structure, But I imagine that if there was an invisible audience, one commenting or providing criticism, someone out there would say that they want structure. Someone would say that they want flow, and they'd be bothered that I don't stick to one thought. And I understand that, because sometimes I wish that people I watch, specifically some YouTubers who do Let's Plays, like, they don't stick to one thought, and I wish they did. Because sometimes those thoughts are really, really interesting, or they're telling a story, and then something happens on the game or on the screen, because they're Let's Players, and then they react to that, and so you lose the story. And you're like, well, maybe they'll bring it back, and then they don't. And you're like, well, I really wanted to hear that story. And you don't, I'm not the kind of person that's like, commenting like, oh man, I really wish they posted that story or said that story or whatever. I just, I think about it for like 10 to 15 minutes after the video's over, and then I move on, because not only was that video recorded before today, or before the day I was viewing it, but it's just, how can I provide constructive criticism to that besides, oh man, I really wish you finished that thought. Luckily though, for me, I'm in the unique position, or maybe not the unique position, but the strong position or beneficial position, however you want to define it, of if someone says, man, I really wish you finished that thought, I can be like, I can go back, listen to it, and be like, oh, that's what I was trying to say, and put it in the description, or I can make a whole new episode out of it. Like, I'm in the position where I can just fix that mistake, you know? And I like that. I think the person who will probably say, I wish I finished that thought the most will be myself. Because I'm not going to lie, some thoughts I have are really interesting, and they just die out. Because I have such a reactionary brain, where it's like you're telling a story, and you're like, this is where the story is going, and then you say something in that story, and you're like, I should probably mention this, and then you get sidetracked, or you decide that the topic wants to go this way, or you want to go a different way, so you decide to go that way. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just I predict, given my bad foresight, I can still predict this. I can predict that sometimes I will criticize myself. Not criticize, but comment like, should have finished that thought. Because some of them are interesting. Some of them are far more enticing than the one I was saying. And maybe that's just my opinion, you know? And there's always going to be two sides of the story. There's going to be one person who liked the story and the other person who wished the story hadn't happened and the other thought had been pursued. And I'm okay with that. Because that means they're engaged, they're listening, and they're following my train of thought. I mean, obviously they're following my train of thought if they're engaged, but what I really mean is they're pursuing the story, you know? And I think that's really, really cool. I say cool, interesting, and okay a lot, and I just mean it, you know? I want you to know that I mean it. That I'm not trying to put on a facade of vocabulary or dumb myself down. I just, at the core of my responses, that's my three main reactions is cool, interesting, or okay, you know. I just wanted to mention that. But I do think it's very cool that people are engaged in podcasts and they put their 2 cents in, which is why I like the SoundCloud timeline bar, where it has the wavelengths and it also has the time elapsed. You've been watching the video or listening to the video. Mostly songs go on SoundCloud, if I'm honest, but sometimes podcasts do too. There's a podcast that I used to listen to that went on SoundCloud, and I just haven't finished it. That's the end of that story. But what I'm trying to say is the commenters on SoundCloud can put comments in certain frames of the timelines frames of the timeline. So at 17:05, commenter A said, "I like this idea," you know, and so it's super easy for the producer of the audio, whatever, you know, to track down that thought and be like, oh, someone liked this. Whereas in opposition to YouTube, people can still put the timeline or the time slot, I believe is what it was called or is called, and they can comment on that, but it's not as quickly given, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because you have to go to the comments and then you have to click on the time slot, then you have to watch the video and wait for it to load. Whereas with SoundCloud, it's like you probably come across it. I don't know. It feels like SoundCloud presents that information a lot quicker than YouTube, and YouTube could probably fix that. I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying that it shows that people are engaged. That's the essence of what I'm trying to get at, is that people are engaged, they comment on a slot or a period of time, and they say, I like that. And, you know, that's probably as far as it goes. Probably because there's a character limit or something on SoundCloud, since those comments are so tiny. But it shows engagement, and I think that's what I want most. I don't care if people agree or disagree or find my structure or my lack of structure tiresome or boring. I think engagement is all I want most. Like, I would love to just have Q&As or discussions about this and that, because, you know, you learn about people. You learn about people even if you're not asking the questions. The question someone asks also shows their personality as much as it shows your personality. If someone says, what's your favorite game? They have an interest in games. whether they've admitted it or not. It's an interest. And of course, there are people that use throwaway questions like that to segue into something, or they just ask because they want to keep talking to the person. But that's the minor exception. There's very few people, and I don't want to say very few, I want to say just a small percentage of most people who meet others of a fame status or of any status like that that's above mediocre or whatever, just common, basically. Most questions will be driven by the person's subconscious or conscious, for the most part, right? And you can disagree, like I said, but my questions would be based around things that I'm interested in. We had Joe Michael Straczynski show up to my community college for I don't want to say lecture. It was more of just it was like a panel, because he gave this long talk about working, how he approached creativity, and I'm sure there was a topic that was going to be addressed. Like, they were like, we want you to talk about this at our college, and he was like, okay, and so he presented a speech. For example, I suppose maybe it was a lecture, I don't really know, but there was a Q&A at the end, and I was given the chance to ask a question, not just me specifically, but like, you stand up, raise your hand, and you ask the question basically. And so my thought was, I'm going to ask what's his favorite science fiction author, because he did a lot of science fiction work. And that reflects my subconscious. That reflects my conscious. More my conscious than my subconscious. I was fully aware I was asking the question, and I was fully aware that why I wanted to ask it, and here's why. I wanted to ask because science fiction has become this budding interest of mine. It started off when, in middle school, I was introduced to Dune by Frank Herbert. More specifically, the prequels written by his son, Brian Herbert, which are pretty good. Star Wars isn't the only thing with a prequel, and it's also not a foundation for what all prequels for science fiction will look like. What I'm trying to say is the Dune prequels are really good. I enjoyed them, and I recommend them. So they're not like the Star Wars prequels, because people don't like those. But I started off my journey in middle school hearing about that, and I started reading the Dune prequels. Took a hiatus, and came back around high school-ish. I just have a bad attention span with books. That's why I stopped. Not because I didn't like it. And so I picked it back up, and I started reading again. And, that began my journey into science fiction. And I read Dude Android's Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And I read A Scanner Darkly just this last summer, which is also by Philip K. Dick. And, I've also read the original Dune. And I've just tried to read as much science fiction as I could, pretty much. I'm pretty into Welcome to Night Vale, a great podcast. I recommend it. It's also an amazing book that I really enjoyed. But what I'm trying to get through this interweaving story is that I went on this journey with science fiction, and so my interest was, what does he think about science fiction? So it says, that question says a lot about me as much as it says about him. And he talked about his favorite science fiction author, whose name I forget, but he did talk about how that science fiction author grew up a lot like Straczynski did, in poverty and, wanting to write for a living, but knowing that wasn't really reliable as a job, et cetera, et cetera. But it reflected both of our personalities, or both of our interests, I suppose, if not personality, because of the journey I took with science fiction and how Straczynski ended up writing Sense8, Babylon 5, and some comic book hero movies. He worked on Thor, the first one, I believe. You can look it up on IMDb. He's not a fake person. He's pretty cool. I liked him a lot. He's very tall, though, which is interesting because I'm 6'3", so that says a lot. But yeah, that's how questions can reflect personality. And I'm really glad that this podcast was made, this episode was made. I know that is a complete shift in topics, But as we start winding down into the end of this episode, just to let you know, I have no idea what time limits are going to be. I just talk until I feel like it's a good enough time to stop. And so here I am kind of winding down. Um, as we, I'm just glad the second episode was made, you know? And I'm going to listen back to it and make sure everything's okay and hope and pray to the technology gods that I don't delete this. But, I don't know, man. I'm just grateful there's listeners. Even just one, you know? And even if that's just me. It's like something I said yesterday. And I don't the problem with making so many podcasts is that you forget which thoughts stayed in your podcast. So I'm always careful of what I reference or what I say or what I said. Like I said earlier, it's like, oh well, did you really say that earlier? But I know for a fact I deleted this because I didn't really say anything yesterday. Yesterday I talked about goodness, I just forgot. Huh. See, like I said, when you forget a thought and people get upset, yeah. Wow. Well, there's a first time for everything. I'm gonna move on, so we're not gonna waste time. And if it comes back to me, I'll put it in the description. Um, so yeah, like I'm winding down. I want to let you know that there's no set time slot because that would just be in opposition to free-form thoughts. You know, if I were to look at the clock and be like, "Oh, it's 20 minutes. I gotta stop." What if there's really good thoughts at 20 minutes? Like around. I felt myself in this episode 1 to 5 minutes. I was like, kind of like, okay, I don't know where this is going. We need to like figure out how to get the ball rolling, pretty much. And as soon as we hit 10, I was like, all right, I'm pretty comfortable. And so I settled into a groove. And at 15 to 20, I was like heavily into the groove. And now we're at 27. And like, I'm still in the groove, but I'm ready to move out of it, pretty much. I just don't want to force it, So that's why it's moving into the 30s at this point, because I just want to let you guys know that there's no forced time slot. However, I don't see myself making an hour-long podcast, only because of recording issues. I've mentioned this in a blog, I believe, but my room is centered in a very high traffic point, and I don't have soundproof walls. So there are 4 to 5 different areas people could be walking into and from. So there's walking noises, talking noises, shower noises, anything like that that could disturb the audio session. So an hour-long podcast is asking a lot. I mean, right now I could probably do an hour-long podcast, but I've settled out of the groove, so I don't want to bore you with my ums and just brief pauses. I'd like to end it where I can. So yeah, I hope you have a great rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see you in the next episode. See ya.